Russ, thank you for joining us. We are excited for this conversation. The three of us have known each other a while, but we're excited to kind of reconnect and have a conversation about e-commerce and retail media. Before we do that, would love to, we're familiar with you and a lot of the Netrush community is as well from speaking at some prior Netrush events. But for those that maybe are unfamiliar, give us your background and let us know what Stratably is up to these days.
Yeah, thanks, Claire and Raj, for inviting me to talk retail media, one of my favorite subjects in the e-commerce industry nowadays. I founded Stratably about 6 or 7 months ago and run stratably.com. It's a newsletter subscription business. And I write research and do content essentially for chief digital officers, VPs of e-commerce, and their teammates at large and mid-sized consumer brands that do business with Amazon and its rivals, so like Walmart, Target, Kroger, et cetera. And I try to help keep them up to date on the market and then arm them with information and tools to help educate their organization. That's a big challenge in this space, as you both know. And so Stratably content and research is meant to help close that information gap between those teams and all of the people they're trying to educate internally. So for those watching, if you want to learn more about Stratably, you can visit stratably.com and check out all the research that I host on that site.
We love it. Raj and I are both subscribers. We connect every morning, and a few times in the week, it's like, hey, did you see what Stratably posted today? Let's talk about it. So yeah, we love the work, and that's why we wanted to have you on. You have been writing a lot about retail media lately. So we figured we would dive in there. It's an important topic, especially today, as more players are coming in, as the cost of advertising is rising, as it gets more competitive. Let's start with kind of just your take on the landscape today. I also think back a couple of years ago, and I think you're one of the ones that kind of officially put a name to this of, hey, this is growing, this is becoming something brands need to be aware of. And you were one of the pioneers in kind of giving it a name and shedding light on what it means for brands. So what's your definition of retail media? Kind of what does the landscape look like today, and why are you writing about it? Why is it important for us to talk about?
So retail media is, I think, very simplistically, I would describe it as paid search that a retailer has on its own website, along with advertising activations that are driven by its first-party data, and that can show up on its own website. It can show up on outside web properties. So essentially search and programmatic, more or less. But all of it's utilizing the traffic that the website has and the audience data that the retailer has collected. Essentially every major retailer has launched a media network at this point. I still get a little bit surprised. Sometimes you'll see like a new announcement of, such and such retailer announces they're launching a retail media network. It's like, at this point, I think I wrote a couple of weeks ago, like, if you're a mid-sized to large retailer, it's essentially like financially irresponsible to not have a media network right now, or at least be trying to drive a media network right now. So all of these retailers have it. If you're a consumer brand, you essentially have to invest in it. And for a lot of omnichannel retailers, it's not even just about doing retail media on that website for the digital business, but it's also about fitting into the broader kind of joint business plans that you have with those retailers. So some retailers are sort of requiring spend on their retail media networks as a part of a broader picture that includes in-store. So there are certain retailers that are requiring spend. So if for no other reason, it's important in that regard. There's also, there's puts and takes, but typically a brand is going to have to advertise in order to have visibility on these sites. Certainly Amazon has, its search engine results page are filled with ads. Like, you need to be advertising in order to get visibility, which is key. And then overarching a lot of this is our macro factors, like privacy initiatives that Apple has done, death of the cookie by Google. So consumer brands are trying to find ways of, how do we reach our consumer? Retailers have this wealth of 1P data. They have sites that are well trafficked. And so there's kind of this macro shift happening in that regard as well. So it's really, pervasive throughout the retail industry. Consumer brands have to have a concerted strategy around retail media in order to be successful online and to some degree to protect their in-store plans with these retailers.
Where do you think is kind of the first place that brands tend to trip up? I think this is a new skill for a lot of brands that they need to learn. And I think just as brands started figuring out Amazon, they were bombarded with all of these other platforms to figure out as well. And so it's complex. It stretches in different areas of the organization. It can be, I think, a challenge for a lot of brands. And you mentioned a few different kind of reasons for investing or benefits of it. Where are maybe the couple areas that you think brands are most challenged with today or getting tripped up?
I think a couple of big picture things stand out with that question. One is consumer brands, it sounds like very simplistic, but they often don't even necessarily have the end goal in mind with some of these investments into retail media. So if you don't kind of know where you're trying to get to, it's hard to know whether spending on retail media on Kroger or Target or Walmart or Amazon or some combination is the right decision, because you don't even necessarily know what you're trying to do. So I think having a clear goal in mind and then understanding, okay, how do we achieve that goal with these different channels? That's key, and I think that's missing from a lot of consumer brands. I think the other thing is that because the growth of these retail media networks has really just taken off in the last year or two, organizations haven't necessarily brought together all of those different options and looked at that holistically. A lot of it is sort of, especially on like very new retail media platforms, a lot of it's still sort of, I'll say, stuck within that account team. And like, they're the only ones that are really looking at it, but they don't necessarily have the expertise or even understand how this compares relative to Amazon or other media activations that a consumer brand might do. So there's this kind of gap or siloing nature inside of consumer brands that I think is a common sort of challenge that a lot of them are facing as a result.
Yeah, for to dig into that a little bit more, it's a cynical point of view from brand perspective is this feels a little bit like extortion. Like, I'm going to be dramatic there. This is just we have to pay to play on the media network. And if we think about brands being, been kind of a chasm between brands and their consumers and their customers to learn about the customer. And a lot of that has been because their customer is the retailer and the retailer has the relationship with the end consumer. Does this break through any of that? Are retail media networks providing valuable consumer information, trends, insights back to brands? Or does this just further entrench this gap of you're putting money into a system and not really getting clear insight back other than placement?
I think it's you're mostly getting placement at this point. I think that measurement and attribution is going to improve in time, and that consumer brands are going to get more, possibly, I guess, insights is sort of what you're describing. And I think they're going to get that because the retailers are going to have to compete on that dimension a little bit to differentiate themselves from each other. So I think that's going to come in time. But right now, it is all about, we need to pay to get visibility. We know that whatever, like 60%, 70%, 80%, there's statistics out there of sales are driven by the top handful of results. And guess what? The top handful of results are all advertising. So it is, you could call it extortion, you could call it a tax, we could iterate on new adjectives to describe it. I think that is sort of like the reality of the situation. Retailers have valuable real estate on their sites, and they're monetizing that value essentially. It doesn't mean that it's terrible for the consumer. I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago where, if you took away advertising and everything's organically driven, well, the organic results, that's a function of, okay, did the did the brand manager select the right keywords and have all of these different factors that go into this black box that then surface these results? Like, that is not necessarily going to be more relevant for the consumer. It's nice you don't have to pay for it, but it's more of like a black box type outcome. Whereas with advertising, every brand can determine for themselves, like, what is the value of this keyword and this position on this keyword? What are we willing to pay to get that visibility to a consumer that searches for it? So it's sort of like pushing down the decision making around relevance. Maybe there's a balance, but it's, to me, it's not like a automatically worse consumer outcome. It's just different. Is I think the right way to think about it.
I like that article. I wanted to touch on that a little bit when we chatted with you today. I think it's an interesting perspective on, hey, does this really offer a different experience for the consumer? Maybe, maybe not. I think it does offer a different situation for the brand and for their wallets, right? I think this has kind of resulted in overall just this bigger emphasis on advertising. We know costs are rising as well. I guess first question is, that article that you wrote on, hey, organic search results are going away. Do you think we've kind of hit the tipping point on that? Or do you think it could go even further, where maybe months from now or next year, 2 years from now, we don't see any organic results?
I think there'll probably always, as pure speculation, I think there'll always be some amount of organic results. I think Amazon is pushing the limits on, like, how much of this page can we fill up with sponsored products, sponsored listings, sponsored brand videos, editorial recommendations, just all of these different kind of flavors of advertising or promotion, if you will. But it hasn't, been obvious that that's, negatively impacted their results. Again, I just have this point of view that it's really not creating a worse consumer experience if done well, because you're letting the brands kind of determine the relevance, and those brands know their brand and products better than what Amazon does, and possibly what the organic algorithm would suggest. That's sort of a controversial point of view, but I think it's just a different way of looking at it. So, and Amazon's the furthest down this path of, like, what is the limit that we can put? Walmart, Target, Home Depot, the big retailers, they're not necessarily at the same level of saturation as Amazon. I think like all things e-commerce, Amazon's sort of like the pioneer, and they're all going to kind of follow. So if you were to look at a page on Walmart today and compare it to a page on Amazon for a given search term, if Amazon has more of that page filled with ads, it's probably a safe bet to assume that, Walmart's going to go down that path, or Instacart's going to go down that path, et cetera.
I want to keep on that. I'm going to sound like I'm the cynical guy now. How much of the success and quick growth of these kind of up and coming retail media networks is due to what you mentioned about there being silos within organizations? Are we still too early to the point where, when they stitch the data together, brands are going to realize, oh wait, the customer acquisition cost was not better for lifetime value than if I were to put that own dollar into my direct to consumer or to my own, own direct e-commerce website? Is some of this just due to uncoordinated internal strategies?
I definitely think that that's the case, that's driving. Like I said another way, I'm not sure that consumer brands have a real clear understanding of the relative opportunities across these different retail media accounts. And certainly not when we start thinking about retail media versus social activations versus traditional activations, et cetera. Like, that whole dynamic is almost just now starting to be really worked on and paid attention to. So I think that's part of what is driving spend on these retail accounts, is sort of a lack of relative comparison across. And so some are maybe able to get dollars that they otherwise wouldn't if there was like very clear transparency on how the return on ad spend was performing. But I think at least as equally big, if not bigger, is that retailers, omni-channel retailers in particular, they have a real need to have a retail media narrative and story and business. And so for some of those omni-channel retailers, they're requiring, a certain minimum amount of spend on their retail media platform that a brand would just otherwise wouldn't make. But they're still making a rational decision in spending that money because they're looking at it from a big picture perspective and say, okay, with our joint business plan with XYZ omni-channel retailer for 2022, we're going to spend whatever, make up a number, $10 million on these different activations. They want 3 million of it to go into their retail media platform. We don't necessarily see the return, but we like the overall deal. They have that KPI that they need to meet, so we're willing to accept it. So I think that's another kind of artificial driving factor in retail media. And I actually have been surprised at the lack of pushback some of the retailers have been getting from the investment community. No one's really asking about that. No one's asking follow-up questions about that. And I think that's going to come, and the tide's going to go out a little bit, and maybe all X billion of retail media spend is not really truly like a market-driven outcome, if you follow me.
You have a lack of reporting to really give you a good indicator of, hey, this is where I should spend my next dollar across all of these different platforms. You have platforms popping up every day. You have retailers saying you need to invest here as part of your JBP, or just broader like FOMO of everyone else is here. I'm seeing headlines. So all of this is happening. We know it's becoming so much more pay to play, but budgets are not unlimited. So how are brands navigating that? How do you see kind of the best in class brands? Are they coming up with that funding and putting it everywhere? Are they being selective with where they place their bets? How are they kind of sorting through all of these different platforms and the pressure to invest everywhere?
I think there's certainly not unlimited funds. The last couple of years, they have been able, I think, to get retail media budget from areas that have been cut back on because of the pandemic. So for example, a lot of brands that did sampling, historically no longer were doing sampling, which is expensive. They cut back on a lot of corporate travel and things of that nature. So there hasn't necessarily been this real reckoning of, okay, we really want to spend on retail media. We don't have these savings from these other areas. Let's assume those come back at some point. So like, where is it going to come from? Is it going to come from in-store activations? Well, the retailers certainly don't want that. My sense is they'll be willing to accept some of that. But what about the other areas? Like what happens with social media spend? There's been for years this sort of ongoing leak of traditional media that can now go into retail media. So I think there's a few sort of sources of funds that will continue to float into retail media, because I think in a lot of respects, like we sort of know this is the future. And so even if like the returns aren't great now, or even if like we can't necessarily like determine with real clarity what the returns are, brands, want to be there. They want to support it. It's just a matter of like, well, what gives, where are we going to, take from?
Is it as simple as kind of the rich get richer of those that have the biggest budgets win here? Or do you think there's a bigger story there?
That's an interesting question. I think historically, paid advertising allowed a lot of upstart brands to get visibility on Amazon because the bigger brands were slower to sort of adopt paid search in some respect. And so there was this opportunity. Now all the big and medium-sized brands are very aware of paid search and its importance on these different retailer websites. So I wonder if that starts to crowd out the opportunity for some of these startup brands, which is interesting. It's coming at an interesting time, right? Because as social advertising gets more challenging because of privacy. There's all these articles, right, about D2C and how, you know, the customer acquisition costs are so high now. So like that's going away at the same time that the ability to really sort of capitalize on marketplaces is also going away, if you will. So that's sort of an interesting question. I think big budgets matter, but I also think like who's going to be the smartest on these things? Who's going to be able to look across these different retail platforms, incorporate it into their broader media planning, and understand how each of these different retailers and different types of activation channels fits into the broader goals, which again, a lot of brands don't have real clear goals. You know, that's going to be a way to help manage rising advertising costs, if you will. The other component we haven't really talked about is just understanding lifetime value. And I think a lot of consumer brands don't necessarily have a good handle on that. That's critical. What is the lifetime value of a newly acquired customer, and then let that dictate, you know, what you're willing to spend to acquire that customer. Again, very simplistic, very basic, but challenging to understand that. And you talk to a lot of brands, and they don't have a clear understanding of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. We know that internally from our own work and the work we did with brands, that you get that data if you're involved with first party transaction data, and you're able to understand. And it really comes down to the business model that you're in. Some business models, or go to Amazon or go to Market Strategies, are not steeped in first party transaction data. Therefore, you're always on this treadmill to acquire the customer as if you're paying for them for the first time. And lifetime value is not part of the picture. So I think that's a really important one. How far off are we from this reckoning where things are going to change? I think we talked about there being just kind of a lack of coordination. Maybe there's an advantage that the retail media networks are in the driver's seat because brands just don't know how to bring the data together. Even worse maybe, or scarier, I think I heard you say that some of the ad spend came from travel budgets and things like that, which makes it feel not very strategic. If that type of discretionary spending is the one where your ad budget's coming from. When's the reckoning coming? Is it a month from now, 6 months from now, 2 years from now?
Well, I think in the reckoning, I think it's gonna be in the form of making this more strategic. So I think you're right. Like a lot of this maybe wasn't strategic. I mean, the pandemic, much like e-commerce, like maybe wasn't strategic before the pandemic, suddenly it was. Well, retail media is a core element of digital commerce, right? If you're doing it on these different retail sites. And so I think this reckoning is this transition from like sort of just doing a lot of things to doing it more strategically. And so what does that require? I think it requires the right internal personnel is one thing. I think it requires the right technology stack or the right partners to help these brands do it. And I think it's a understanding of, from a budgeting and a funding perspective, how does retail media fit within our broader media and activation and marketing plan? So a couple of things there. One is you're starting to see, especially in bigger brands, they're starting to hire retail media specialists, if you will. And these roles are not always real clearly defined, but it's brands saying like, wow, there's all these retail media networks. There seems like there's a lot of opportunity, but boy, they're asking us for a lot of money. How do we make sense of this? We don't exactly know what the answer is. Let's put a smart person or a smart team together to help us go and figure that out. So you're starting to see companies put people into these retail media roles to help shed light on that. And then that can help drive answers around how does this fit into our broader sort of marketing efforts, and how much budget should be allocated, and where should the budget come from. So I think in a lot of respects, like that type of hire has just started happening in the last 6 months or so, 6 to 12 months. And so I think that's going to become more prevalent over the next year. And then that's going to help flesh out some of the answers to these questions. And look, along the way, like some of the smaller retail media networks, they might not ever get much traction. They might not really take off. So maybe some of them sort of go away and you're left with, the really big accounts. So it's just a very early time, I think, in the space. For Amazon, obviously it's $31 billion business, so it's not necessarily early for them. But it's really like all these other retail media networks, and how do we deal with them through the consumer brand lens.
I would love to dig in a little bit more to that internal personnel and kind of what you need on the team. Those retail media specialists or other team members that are kind of attacking retail media today, like what skills are needed? What skills or experiences would you look for?
Yeah, I've thought a little bit about this. I think I'll answer the question. I'll add to the question a little bit. So I feel like e-commerce it's getting, we've obviously come a long way in a couple of years with e-commerce. So e-commerce teams are not rare by any stretch at this point. Even like a VP of e-commerce, like the head of e-commerce is much more common today than it was just a few years ago. And I think at that kind of VP of e-commerce level, you want that like sort of generalist, they're skilled in, they have had some level of exposure to Amazon advertising or retail media generally, but they also understand sort of all the aspects that matter for e-commerce, whether it's supply chain to operational things to product content, et cetera. So, I think that VP of e-commerce, kind of this like generalist type person, in addition to retail media like specialists, I think you're getting what I was describing before was like that role of like, how do we bridge the organization? How do we bring these different teams together? How do we bring this information and make sense of it from a holistic perspective? That's what I was describing as the retail media specialist role. In addition to that, you're starting to see brands hire onto the e-commerce team paid search specialists and programmatic specialists. Like it's getting so advanced and so complex that specialists are required essentially, or you're going to be, outsourcing this to specialists. So as e-commerce teams have just gotten more mature, you're just starting to see the importance of some of these sort of like specialty roles get hired and join part of the team. But to, I think, really excel, because you have all of these different options that are now available to you, prioritization really matters, and where that money comes from really matters. And how do we activate across all of these things in an efficient way really matters. And so like the nature of the game's sort of changing. A few years ago, it was all about Amazon advertising, and it still is. That's still, the biggest growth opportunity, the biggest dollar opportunity for most consumer brands out there. So that continues to be the area of emphasis. But okay, now Walmart's asking us to spend, Target, Michaels, Nordstrom, Best Buy, et cetera. We have to have a plan to do that. And we can't let that plan fall to our account manager for the given account.
I also think it can be prioritization, of the assortment as well, right? So I think in general, e-commerce has moved to be narrower, move away from kind of the endless aisle and more, hey, maybe the supply chain isn't built for the endless aisle. Maybe our budgets aren't built for the endless aisle now that it's more than just you list it and it sells. And so maybe it's also kind of, again, hopefully using data to guide the way here, but maybe it's also prioritizing, hey, with my Amazon advertising budget, with my Walmart Connect budget, where am I really going to focus? And then what are the areas that I'm just not going to spend as heavily on because they're longer tail, because they maybe don't make sense. And again, our budgets are not unlimited.
Absolutely. And I come back to what's the lifetime value and how do you sort of optimize an assortment for that. And, we should be, trying to drive the highest margin, items that match with growth, depending on what your goals are. We should be smart about it. We shouldn't be listing every single item. our assortment necessarily, nor should we be putting paid spend against every, single item. So that's just where we've just sort of like advanced to another level of maturity, I think. And brands have done that to varying degrees on Amazon, and hopefully, they're taking those lessons and applying them to the other retail media options at their disposal, acknowledging that retail media is it's not always easy to compare apples to apples, but to the extent that you can, I think that's key.
That kind of holistic person that's bringing it all together, that's a bit of the brand runner that we talk about here at Netrush, where there's all these different platforms and retailers and silos inside the organization. You really need one person, in this case it's retail media, but it could be even broader, one person that is bringing those teams together, kind of bringing all the data together and using all that to figure out what's our holistic strategy, what's our next best move. You also, if we can kind of finish that conversation on internal personnel, because I think it's interesting, and I think this is like oftentimes a really big question that brands have. You mentioned that the holistic person and strategist is key, and then you also mentioned, hey, the really technical experts that are managing the spend, the paid search specialist or the programmatic specialist. We know the environment is crazy today. Like, how likely is it for brands to hire those people in? What's kind of the competitive dynamic there? And is it, I think another common question is like, hey, do we bring this in-house or do we use a partner? So what do you kind of see brands doing as they work through the competitive environment? Not many true experts out there yet. And figuring out, do we insource or outsource or a little bit of both?
It's a terrible answer, but I think it's a mix, it's all of the above. But the common thread is that it's a great time if you have that specialty, paid search or programmatic on retail media networks, because you are very much in demand and it's very challenging for consumer brands to hire it. So I think a lot of them, in those cases that aren't able to attract that type of talent are going to rely on partners. There's obvious risk in that. I think you need people internally that can at least, I'll say, hit the ball back, with those partners, understand enough to make sure that the partners are really driving true, value for the business. So even if you don't have the internal expertise, you need someone with enough knowledge in order to have an effective agency partner, essentially. So, but I think you're right. I think from a talent perspective, these people are rare, and it is very challenging to find. So you will see like the other alternative is like upskilling, and so their education in this space continues to be such a big component for those inside that are running e-commerce. They, as far as the industry has come, they're still having to continually educate their colleagues, and it's almost like it's less so about like the importance of e-commerce, and more now like let's actually train so and so on how to do paid search and how to do product content, or how to use these syndication tools or whatever. Like, it's sort of in that sense more technical. I will say the caveat to that is like retail media, I think there is just a lot of like general education that needs to be done, a lot of C-suite education that needs to be done because it is so new. So I've always thought, like, from a retention perspective, that is a part of the job, is education. But if you're like head of e-commerce is spending 90% of their time trying to educate the organization, like something's wrong. Like, they can't be doing all of their time educating. They have to actually be like strategizing and like doing things online. So there's this like kind of balance. Like, you can only spend so much time educating before it just crowds out everything. And like if you've got great talent, they don't want to just do that internally and sort of like push a boulder up a hill, so to speak. So I think there's a balance around that.
Yeah, I like the education topic. And it was one of multiple you've identified. There's education on technical skills, how do I run PPC management. There's education that the brand runner has to do for the rest of the organization, making the business case and talking about what modern commerce is. And earlier you mentioned that even investors were not asking the right questions as it relates to media spend. So you went all the way from investor, all the way down to and board level, all the way down to technical. Education was missing all the way.
Absolutely, yeah. It just this, the industry's so dynamic. Again, like if we hadn't had the pandemic and we hadn't had every omni-channel retailer suddenly put like a ton of investment and focus into e-commerce, then much of the industry would have been educated around Amazon at this point. It just, the environment has gotten, there's just so many more options now, and there's so much more complexity as a result. And I think within retail media, as much as it's been covered by the industry, and as much as retailers have started talking about it, I still think that retail media is wildly underestimated in the change it's going to drive over the next 5 to 10 years. This is like a fundamentally important concept, capability, whatever, that consumer brands need to become great at in order to remain very, very competitive and grow share and be profitable online going forward. So a lot of people are talking about it now, but I think the ultimate outcome of it is going to be much bigger and more transformational than what we think it is going to be sitting here today.
Along those lines, I have a couple kind of forward-looking questions that I want your perspective on, like where is this going over the next few years? You wrote an article maybe a couple weeks back about this shift towards non-endemic strategies, and the example that you used was Best Buy, and we touched on this a little bit earlier in the conversation. I want to dig in more, but the Best Buy example was all about beyond just the brands that are that have consumer electronics products that are selling on Best Buy. Hey, there can be a use case for Best Buy's retail media platform beyond that, just driven by the captive audience they have and the consumer data they have. And so you mentioned kind of this this value that the retailers have that they're monetizing. And we talked about death of the cookie and those types of things. And that over here at Netrush is, kind of something that is driving us as well to think through, how do you get closer to your consumer? How do you get more data on them? How do you own that a little bit more as so much of that third-party data is going away? Can you talk just a little bit more about kind of the consumer's role in all of this, and where is that going over time? Like, can we see more of those Best Buy examples over time as retail media progresses?
I think so. I think every major retail media platform is going to have a programmatic capability because they have so much first-party data. And again, that's like even more valuable today than it ever was before because of what's happening in social. You've had a lot of consumer brands try to collect their own first-party data over the last couple of years by doing, if you're a very large CPG organization, for example, you likely rolled out D2C initiatives with one of the big reasons being to collect that first-party data. It's difficult to scale that, and so that's why the retailer's first-party data is so powerful. The point I was trying to make in the non-endemic article I wrote, where you could be selling hand soap and actually want to tap into Best Buy's first-party data because maybe they have a certain type of consumer that you're trying to reach with your hand soap product, even though you're never going to sell hand soap into a Best Buy. The reason I wrote that is because if you talk to CPG brands today, their almost entire philosophy is that this is retail media. We're going to look at it through the lens of retail sales on the given platform for wherever you're spending that retail media dollar. But we know because car companies use Amazon advertising. Insurance companies use Amazon advertising. They're not, selling their products on Amazon. We know that that's fundamentally flawed. So what I was trying to say in that article is let's not artificially restrict ourselves to only participating on retail media networks where we have retail sales. Any retail media platform is possibly valuable. Now, I think we're not there yet because consumer brands are already overwhelmed with just the number of platforms where they do have business. So that's one reason why we're not really there yet. But I think that's going to come, and that's going to be, that's going to take time to become apparent. But I just think it's inevitable. And so that was sort of the point of like, let's get out of this. Like we have to be selling on the retailer in order to use their retail media platform. That's just fundamentally, not true. So you have to be examining these different audiences and what does the Best Buy audience look like? And is that unique in some way to what we can leverage from a programmatic perspective on Walmart or Amazon? And does it fit with this new product innovation that we're coming out with? So it was really trying to challenge that status quo thinking around what platforms matter and how do we evaluate spend on those platforms.
That makes sense. And I love the call out and the perspective because again, it's bringing brands closer to the consumer, right? So not just the retailer at hand, that we tend to do business with and that we think is our customer, but instead let's dive one step deeper. Where are our consumers? Where can we target them? What data can we pull in? And so I think you're right, where brands are not fully there yet, but that's where we're going. And that's where kind of the leading brands are going to maximize, their presence and their efforts as it relates to retail media.
Exactly. Now, I think there's one watch out. So if you're running retail media for one of these retailers, I think there's one watch out in that, is there ever at some point consumer pushback on the retailers for leveraging this data? Like how long is it until we see like a headline around a government inquiry into consumer data that retailers are using for ad targeting? Purely speculative at this point, it really hasn't happened. But just like there's pushback on all these social media companies, like if Amazon goes too far, if Walmart goes too far, like these are giant companies, right? And so that's like one area of like, what are the limits to the data that can be leveraged? I think when the COVID-19 vaccines were rolled out, there was like the drugstores were like, hey, we're capturing all of this consumer data because people are coming in for the first time and having to sign up. And it was like sort of like obvious, like, oh boy, that's not great. And there was a little bit of blowback on some of those drugstore chains because of that. So, is that something that's going to come down the line and impact these retailers like it has these social media platforms? I don't know, but I think it's one watch out. Again, we're probably a few years away from that, but if I were running a retail media business, you'd have to be, kind of careful because everyone's out there right now saying, yeah, like we've got all this data and we're going to advertise to these consumers. And it's just new. So consumers haven't really caught on to like, yeah, they're really using this data in a big way. Maybe they don't care ultimately, but it's just one kind of watch out that I'm paying attention to.
Russ, anything we haven't touched on yet? As it relates to retail media, what brands need to be thinking about, how they can get ahead, what they're missing?
I would just kind of come back to some of the topics we covered before. I think you have seen all this complexity get introduced in terms of the number of activations that are now possible. Have you, as a consumer brand, have you grown that team enough to support that complexity? Have you invested enough into capabilities to support that complexity? I think a lot of brands haven't over these last couple of years. So I think that's a big area of opportunity. A lot of silos exist inside these organizations. So if you're a chief digital officer, I think that would be, one of the biggest areas of focus is how do we break down these silos between sales, e-commerce, and let's call it like brand marketing. How do we take a holistic perspective on these things? And then understanding again, what is the goal? Like, what are we trying to achieve? And what are the best ways that we can achieve it? And let's not let any artificial restrictions stop us from achieving those goals. So just because, you know, brand managers in the past could only spend on TV ads and social media, well, they should be able to tap into programmatic on retail media. And even though historically with a new product launch, maybe you only did social or something like that, you know, real upper funnel, maybe it makes sense to invest that in paid search on Instacart, let's say. Like that, you have to take sort of that holistic approach, that blank page approach, I think, given the emergent status of retail media networks. And so I think the brands that can do that are going to come out ahead over the next several years.
What I'm also hearing is that holistic approach and then not being afraid to test and learn, right? So it's, hey, what are these new levers or these different kind of pathways that we can think about reaching our goal? And there's all these different platforms and there's these different approaches. We need to test and learn and pivot quick to kind of figure out what works. But yeah, I think there's a big kind of test and learn piece to that as well that can also be challenging, you know, within big consumer brands, I think.
And that's a big cultural thing too. Like some brands have a real test and learn mindset and others don't. And typically the ones that do have it, they were early on Amazon as an example. And they're going to be early on some of these other things. And the ones that were late on Amazon are probably going to be late to retail media and so on. So it's like, that's a real cultural thing that starts at the top, the senior management, but there is no other way, I think, to succeed in e-commerce outside of a test and learn mindset. There's too many new models that emerge. There's too many, in this case, we're talking retail media. There's too many retail media platforms. There's components within the platform. Some will work, some won't work. So you have all of these different options. You need to be sort of like a venture capitalist, if you will, a lot of little bets to understand, hey, what's going to take off? What's going to be meaningful to us? And that just is a philosophical, cultural thing that if a company doesn't have it, they need to be working towards that, because feedback loops are much shorter, you know, today than what they ever have been before. And you can take advantage of it if you have the right mindset.
Well said. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Russ. This was fun. This was super insightful. And this was, you know, one topic, an important topic, but one of many that we're all, you know, dealing with every day in the world of e-commerce that you're writing about at Stratably. So we'll keep the conversation going, of course. Always value your perspective. So thanks. We'll do this again soon, but loved having you on to talk retail media today.
Well, thank you, Claire. Thank you, Raj. Keep up the good work at Netrush, and hopefully we'll get to chat again soon.